I think I'm right in saying that the Russians have lost in Afghanistan, the British have lost in Afghanistan, we are losing in Afghanistan, and frankly, why do we care if that might somehow trigger war there, perhaps even between Pakistan and India? Why do we care?
Well, first of all, of course, you might have detected in my thinking that I don't think we're losing. Secondly, very briefly, just to be historically accurate, the British actually did not lose in their first Afghan war for about 4 years. They had actually a rather simple time of it till they began to get really stupid and cut the subsidies and raise the taxes and cut off the money of the tribal leaders, where they created a tribal force. And there are a few other people who came through there, like Genghis Khan, who didn't lose either. I really think Afghanistan is not the graveyard of empires. It should be the graveyard of allegories. But we may lose. It is possible. We are not losing now. We still have a great deal of popular support among Afghans. It's very different in that respect from Iraq. Even when a great many Iraqis wanted us to stay because they knew they couldn't survive without us, they really, really didn't want us there. It's difficult to describe unless you've lived with it, which I don't necessarily recommend, but I've done. And the inward hostility to the foreign presence in Iraq is a very, very different environment from what you have the great many Afghans. I don't think we have to lose. You asked a very fundamental question. Why do we care? Well, Pakistan, being a nation of 150 or 70 million with nuclear weapons, and with probably the worst control of their nuclear weapons of any of the nuclear states, is a serious issue. Secondly, if you go to a civil war in Afghanistan, what it will mean is, and I should have said this, that it will pull in all the outsiders. It will pull them in because each one will be afraid that in their party, their clients losing, they will be endangered. So you will have the Pakistanis and the Indians and the Iranians and the Russians, at a minimum, all back in the war. That has a prospect of destabilizing a good part of Central Asia for rather a long time. I cannot absolutely prove that this will be dangerous to us, any more than one can prove the alternative, except to say we've turned our back on this area twice, and it has risen up and bitten us hard both times. We turned our back after the Soviets left, and we ended up getting the Taliban. We turned our back effectively even when we had the Taliban. We got 9/11. That doesn't prove you will have it again. It does suggest, though, that there are serious risks. We are still fighting people who think they're at war with us. Now, jihadist websites talk about 9/11 as the raid on New York. They don't talk about it as terrorist action. They talk about it as the raid on New York, a military action as part of a military campaign. They are not proposing to stop. I don't know of any historical example of one side withdrawing unilaterally from a war when the other side wasn't quitting. And you will have an enormous psychological boost to jihadists who will see our withdrawal early and the collapse as the victory of the second superpower. And that's a heck of a shot in the arm for people who think they want to keep fighting under difficult conditions. Every point is arguable, and it is expensive, and we're facing budget difficulties. But I think there is much, my answer, which may not convince you, but my answer is that there is much too much at risk simply to say, we don't care. We can walk away and turn our back again. Sure. Get this gentleman and then get the lady in the middle, and then you'll know where you're going with the microphone, which is more than I may know where I'm going with the answers.
How much United States learned from Soviet experience, military and politically? And second question, if to leave Afghanistan, it would be more problematic with more dangerous consequences than to leave Vietnam?
You know, Vietnam has the wonderful example that we already know what happened. Let me take the first part first. Have we learned from the Soviets? We've learned some things. We've learned a lot less than I think perhaps we could have. The Soviets themselves had learned some things that they were not able to apply. They learned that trying to push rapid social change on Afghan villages was a good way to instigate insurgency and blowback, but they were fundamentally incapable of controlling their Afghan allies. There's a long record now, which is now public and has come out, of the Soviets advising and pressing their various Afghan clients to slow down on some of their efforts to radically alter society. But their Afghan clients were busier killing each other and striving for power than they were in paying attention to the advice. We have learned not to force green troops into ways that destroy the Afghan government and army. An example, the Afghan army under the Soviets was a forced draft of people rapidly deserting, and that army was falling apart a great deal faster than it was being built. In fact, it was only after the Soviets left that President Najibullah, with money, was able to build quite a solid defense for 2 years when everybody thought he would fall. What you're seeing with us is, I think, a much better experience. A lot of things still that are far from perfect. I don't want to exaggerate this, I really don't. But recruitments have run, and recruitments are all voluntary. Nobody's being forced, which was one of the mistakes the Soviets made that created a lot of resentment. Nobody's being forced to join the Afghan army or the police. And enrollments have run steadily ahead of recruitment targets. We actually reached the target of volunteers for the Army for 2011 in October. We still have a problem, to be frank, about attrition, people deserting. Part of it's deserting, and part of it's the kind of problem Washington had at Valley Forge, people going home to take care of their families and not coming back fast enough. I mean, it's not a problem with which we have no historical experience. But overall, the response is much better. The building of elite units has gone very well, both the so-called civil order police, the elite detachments in the police, and the elite units of the Afghan army. I think one lesson we've learned is that we can't pick leaders. We may not like the ones we have, or in some cases they may not be the most enthralling, but we have figured out slowly that we generally get it wrong. From Diem to Chalabi, when we have tried to pick leaders, we've usually made a mess. There's very little you can point to where we have changed leaders and done it right and have things come out. So there are some things we have learned. There are others where we have regular discussions with the Soviets about whether we're not learning other lessons that they have. Those discussions go on. Not Soviets now, it's Russians. The Russians have actually been reasonably helpful and becoming more helpful in Afghanistan over time. Their first big aid was the negotiation of a very, very substantial debt rescheduling with the Afghans. One of the strange success stories of Afghanistan is they've managed to stabilize the currency and keep it stable since about 2003. And given the amount of aid funding pouring into the country, I mean, this is quintessentially a situation in which you ought to see rampant inflation and things going crazy, and in fact, they've managed to stabilize the currency. So there are some lessons. The Vietnam question is basically, I think, if I'm not putting too many words in your mouth, the dominoes didn't fall there, so therefore they won't fall here. So, you know, what are you on about? Could be, you know. I have not said to you that I have a crystal ball or a perfect projection of the future, but there are very few similarities. I think it is the Civil War I describe is pretty predictable. because there are more people talking about it in Afghanistan than there ever were before. I was struck when I went back in 2010 how many people are talking about civil war that never were talking about it before. And this is very different from the past. I mean, in 25 years of war, nobody fought to secede from Afghanistan. People who say this isn't a real country need to look at the fact that nobody tried to set up a separate peace in 25 years of war. When the Soviets were pulling out, they made overtures to both the Tajik and Uzbek leaders to secede, to build rump states in order to provide security along the Soviet border, and those were rejected. So here's a country where people have not broken apart, and yet now they're talking about civil war. And I could give you a number of personal examples. So I think there is an evidence that is not theoretical about the dangers that I speak of. I can go back to it in more detail if you want, but then somebody else won't get a chance at a question. Ma'am, you had the next question.
Thank you.
Now, I'm probably missing people in the back. Wait a minute.
Hi, Emily Altman. I'm an independent consultant on financial services issues. I wanted to ask you to talk just a bit about the economic transition, if you would, and from a completely aid-dominated economy, and whether or not you see that as possible, and to what extent it has an impact on the rest of the transition.
Yeah, it's going to be a rough ride. There are probably some good things. I think we have shoved too much money into places that couldn't absorb it and not spread it out very well. I think financial controls have not been where they could be. And it creates a kind of feeding frenzy at the public trough. And if the reduction is handled in ways that diminish some of that, it won't be all bad. There are some sectors of the Afghan economy which have shown some promise. Telecommunications is one where they basically just leapfrogged over the whole generation of hardwire and went to cell phones and computers and things. And that's profitable. They've made a steady, I forget the figures, but it's a steady financial gain for the government. There are now 4 different cell phone companies. Worked much better than Iraq. Iraq, somehow we made a complete mess out of it, and we got companies that were fighting for market share by not cooperating with each other. So if you were in Baghdad and you went 200 miles, went up the Kurdish areas, your cell phone didn't work, and you'd have a different one. But that didn't help because you couldn't call Baghdad. In Afghanistan, the phones work all over the country pretty well. I mean, I've been down in fire bases outside of Lashkar and Helmand where I had to get up on a HESCO to get a little clearer communication, but was able to reach Kabul and say things like, hey, I've just got an appointment tonight with President Karzai. Does the ambassador think he should go? So communications worked. There are a lot of imponderables. Part of the policy problem, I think, is the lack of clarity is also pushing people to take money out of the country and not to risk. So you can't divorce the economics from the politics. And then you've got a number of things which I think sometimes we've hyped a little too much that could make a considerable change in the economy. We've done a certain amount of work reworking the Russian well logs and overflights, and we've determined that there are 3 or 4 times as many geological structures that may hold gas and oil as we ever knew about before. But until you get exploration started and drill holes and do seismic work on the ground, you don't absolutely know whether these structures have cracked over geological time and lost the content, whether they link up in a way that's economically profitable for foreign companies. One of the things that they've changed the law to make exploitation now profitable. They still have to change a law to make going in and searching for new resources sufficiently profitable to be attractive. They've had some success. The Chinese are investing $3 billion in the copper industry. It's a reasonably large sum of money. One of the big questions is, are the Chinese going to do this in a way that uses a lot of Afghans, that flows money into the economy, or are the Chinese going to hog this thing, send in Chinese workers, and you get very little benefit? Not clear at this question. So, all I'm really able to do is tell you there's a lot of pieces to work with that may save the situation, And none of them are certain enough that I can tell you, standing here in good conscience, that they will work for sure. Let me go over on this side, sir, and then I want to get a couple. Wait for the mic. Wait for the mic. I got my instructions.
How much public support do you think the Taliban has among the Afghan people, and do you believe they can be trusted to live up to commitments they would make in any negotiation?
Little and no. Let me amplify that just slightly. Everything we know from surveys, from talking to people, from interrogations, is that the Taliban has a very small base of ideological support. What it does have, though, is a really big concentration of people who are scared. I think sometimes we forget about, what Afghans have lived through. And if I can just segue for a second on culture, I would suspect that pretty much everybody in this room has learned in their life that when life is tough, you work harder and you succeed, and that your own efforts can be a major part of success. And think about what Afghans have lived through. Or think about how we look at life as normal, and when something disturbs it like a hurricane, we expect it to get fixed and get back to normal, and by God, if the government doesn't do it reasonably quickly, we're pretty critical about that. Afghans have lived through now 30 years of warfare. They've lived through their culture, their country, being constantly overturned by huge forces outside their control. The people who really want to go to the barricades for ideology are mostly dead. So they've learned to survive. And that means you don't stick your head up too far. So what the Taliban has got is a lot of passivity of people afraid to step up. One of the things you're seeing in the areas where we've had a major impact is you are getting more cooperation. Areas like Marja, where there was a huge amount of fighting, you now have local security forces that are keeping Taliban down. You've got civilians regularly turning in the locations of buried explosives and things like this, IEDs. So it's a small base, and it has a little support. They've projected a little bit into the north, and there's some dangers there, but it's a very, outside the Pushtun population, it's also a very small support. On negotiations, I don't think there's any reason to assume that they would be kept. I think it's very important when we talk about negotiations that we talk not about verifiable negotiations, but about enforceable negotiations. The past of negotiations in Afghanistan looks very much like Renaissance medieval Europe. Agreements were made and kept as long as it suited people and until one side felt it was strong enough to break the agreement. So verification isn't going to be enough. We had a verifiable agreement out of the Paris peace talks in Vietnam. We had a group of peacekeepers, which in those days included the Iranians from the Shah's regime, running around Vietnam telling us the accords were being systematically violated. Didn't matter. We'd run out of political will. Made no difference. So there are ways to have enforceable agreements, but we're going to have to be clear that that's part of the issue if we negotiate. Let me get a couple in here because I know there were some hands in the cadets. Please.
Cadet Constantine with the United States Military Academy.
Whoop, you got to say it again to the microphone.
I'll use the mic. Sir, I'm Cadet Constantine with the United States Military Academy. And earlier you had mentioned that foreign economic support is vital to the long-term interests of Afghanistan. On this same note, what role, if any, do you see non-governmental organizations serving in Afghanistan in the long term?
There are an awful lot of them there, and they run the gamut from very competent, not so competent. There's also a whole separate category of Afghan organizations that call themselves NGOs, many of which are really for-profit companies, but there are a few that are genuine NGOs. There are a certain number of them that are working basically at the grassroots. Global Partnership for Afghanistan is one I know fairly well that has done some really great things in agriculture. Others are working much more implementing foreign aid driven projects, larger scale. The role of the smaller ones, I think, is going to be, I think the role of both will be important, but the role of the smaller ones in many ways is vital because they're teaching skills and making an impact The thing about them, though, is it's very difficult to scale up that kind of work. I mean, leaving aside the more recent criticism of Greg Mortenson's outfit, when you read 3 Cups of Tea or whatever the second one's, Schools Out of Stones or whatever it was, you see a basically valid process, but you see one that takes enormous amounts of time and energy to do one school at a time. And that's a valid process, but it's not one you can scale up and speed up. You know, we built, when I left, we had built almost 600 schools in Afghanistan. But the need is huge. There were fewer than 1 million children in school at the time of the war. There are now 8 million children in school. There's still a lot to be done. We've trained something like 6,000 teachers, but that's mostly taking high school graduates and training them to be primary school teachers, which is something you can do fairly quickly. It doesn't meet the need for high school teachers that need a different level of education. So there's a huge room for NGOs to work. And frankly, I think we'd be better off if we had directed a little more money and helped more NGOs work in some of the stable areas where I think we'd get more impact for our efforts than pouring everything into the areas where it's hardest to work. I think we will still need many of the larger ones as well, because building capacity in Afghanistan is a slow process. Sometimes we act as though if you just trained them, they ought to be able to do this. Now, I don't know any parent that thinks they could grab their kid out of the 10th grade, throw them in as a junior in college, give them a lot of tutoring, in 2 years they'd graduate. And yet we expect the equivalent of people that in many cases have less background than a 10th grader in high school. I do see progress, but I want to be very careful not to exaggerate this. I know a fair number of younger Afghans in the 20s and 30s. There's a different feeling there. There are people who want something different for their country, but it's going to take, and some of them are really impressive. They're really the people that sort of pick up your spirits on a bad day. I met a girl today, just 21. She graduated from Middlebury. She's going back, or she's been back. She's back on a trip, running a small school program that was designed by an American NGO to take Afghan girls and send them after they finish high school for another year of high school in American schools so that they get up to the level where they can enter good colleges and universities. And so far, those people are all going back to Afghanistan. That's the kind of NGO project that over time has a huge impact. But if you expect it to deliver hundreds of trained people really quickly, you're going to be disappointed. I don't know whether I've given you an answer or just kind of rambled around the territory. Let me get one in the back. Wait for the mic. I'm obedient to instruction mostly. Hey.
I'm a military pilot. I was in the wars between Vietnam and the Gulf, so I saw quite a bit of it. And you indicated there's a lack of articulation about the policy of exit strategy. So if you could, and if people would listen to you, what would your articulation be?
King for a day. I would articulate that we are going to keep an adequate force for a longer period than 2014, not to take the burden from the Afghans, but to make sure that we have a dense enough advisory process that we build the quality that's going to be required. I would particularly indicate that we will continue to finance that army. In a sense, we don't have to convince people that we're going to win. We have to convince them that the Afghan army is not going to lose, because that then changes the entire strategic picture, both for the Pakistanis and for the insurgents. The biggest clarity of all is that we're going to fund the army. I would also indicate, I would actually clarify that in this transition period, we're going to keep enough force that the Afghans are not going to be asked to take unreasonable burdens before they're ready to do it. That actually is, about 3/4 of the existing policy, but we don't clarify it to the American people. nor have we made the out-year decision. So we're asking General Allen to plan a transition from now to 2014, but he doesn't know how many troops he's going to have in 2013. So he's got to make planning assumptions about, where to fight, where to transfer, and he doesn't know whether, some piece of the rug is going to get jerked out from under him. He's very disciplined about this, but I'm not in the government, so I don't have to be disciplined. So I think the minimum clarification that we're going to keep a level of funding that allows these forces to grow and mature, and that we're not walking away, is what we need. There's a lot more one could say or could do or could argue about whether you should do or shouldn't do, but those elements are the critical ones. How are we doing on time? Okay, I think we've run out. So thank you very much. Great questions, great audience.
Thank you, Ambassador. You talked about clarity, and to me, you've given a level of detail to the Afghan picture that you don't pick up in the media, and for that, I think we're very appreciative.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.